Marius Part 2. Marius Pontmercy went, like all children, through various studies. When he left the hands of Angèle Normand, his grandfather entrusted him to a worthy professor of the purest classic innocence. This young, unfolding soul passed from a prude to a pedant. Marius had his years at college, then he entered the law school. He was royalist, fanatical, and austere. He had little love for his grandfather, whose gaiety and cynicism wounded him, and the place of his father was a dark void. For the rest, he was an ardent but cool lad, noble, generous, proud, religious, lofty, honorable even to harshness, pure even to unsociableness. In 1827, Marius had just attained his 18th year. On coming in one evening, he saw his grandfather with a letter in his hand. "Marius," said Monsieur Gillenormand, "you will set out tomorrow for Vernon." "What for?" said Marius. "To see your father." Marius shuddered. He had thought of everything but this, that a day might come when he would have to see his father. Nothing could have been more unlooked for, more surprising, and we must say, more disagreeable. It was aversion compelled to intimacy. It was not chagrin. No, it was pure drudgery. Marius, besides his feelings of political antipathy, was convinced that his father, the sabrer, as Monsieur Gillenormand called him in the gentler moments, did not love him. That was clear, since he had abandoned him and left him to others. Feeling that he was not loved at all, he had no love. Nothing more natural, said he to himself. He was so astounded that he did not question Monsieur Gillenormand. The grandfather continued, "It appears that he is sick. He asks for you." The next day at dusk, Marius arrives at Vernon. Candles were just beginning to be lighted. He asked the first person he met for the house of Monsieur Pontmercy. For in his feelings he agreed with the Restoration, and he, too, recognized his father neither as baron nor as colonel. The house was pointed out to him. He rang. A woman came and opened the door with a small lamp in her hand. "Monsieur Pontmercy," said Marius. The woman remained motionless. "Is he here?" asked Marius. The woman gave an affirmative nod of the head. "Can I speak with him?" The woman gave a negative sign. "But I am his son," resumed Marius. "He expects me." "He expects you no longer," said the woman. Then he perceived that she was in tears. She pointed to the door of a low room. He entered. In this room, which was lighted by a tallow candle on the mantel, there were 3 men, one of them standing, one on his knees, and one stripped to his t-shirt and lying at full length upon the floor. The one upon the floor was the colonel. The 2 others were a physician and a priest who was praying. The colonel had been 3 days before attacked with a brain fever. At the beginning of the sickness, having a presentiment of ill, he had written to Monsieur Gillenormand to ask for his son. He had grown worse. On the very evening of Marius's arrival at Vernon, the colonel had a fit of delirium. He sprang out of his bed in spite of the servant, crying, "My son has not come. I am going to meet him." Then he had gone out of his room and fallen upon the floor of the hall. He had but just died. The doctor and the curé had been sent for. The doctor had come too late. The curé had come too late. The son also had come too late. By the dim light of the candle, they could distinguish upon the cheek of the pale and supine colonel a big tear which had fallen from his death-stricken eye. The eye was glazed, but the tear was not dry. This tear was for his son's delay. Marius looked upon this man whom he saw for the first time and for the last, this venerable and manly face, these open eyes which saw not, this white hair, these robust limbs upon which he distinguished here and there brown lines which were saber cuts, and a species of red stars which were bullet holes. He looked upon that gigantic scar which imprinted heroism upon the face on which God had impressed goodness. He thought that this man was his father, and that man was dead, and he remained unmoved. The sorrow which he experienced was the sorrow which he would have felt before any other man whom he might have seen stretched out in death. Mourning, bitter mourning, was in that room. The servant was lamenting by herself in a corner. The curé was praying, and his sobs were heard. The doctor was wiping her eyes. The corpse itself wept. This doctor, this priest, and this woman looked at Marius through their affliction without saying a word. It was he who was the stranger. Marius, too little moved, felt ashamed and embarrassed at his attitude. He had his hat in his hand. He let it fall to the floor. to make them believe that grief deprived him of strength to hold it. At the same time, he felt something like remorse, and he despised himself for acting thus. But was it his fault? He did not love his father indeed. The colonel left nothing. The sale of his furniture hardly paid for his burial. The servant found a scrap of paper which he handed to Marius. It contained this in the handwriting of the colonel. For my son, the emperor made me a baron upon the battlefield of Waterloo. Since the Restoration contests this title which I have bought with my blood, my son will take it and bear it. I need not say that he will be worthy of it. On the back the colonel had added, at this same battle of Waterloo, a sergeant saved my life. This man's name is Thénardier. Not long ago, I believe he was keeping a little tavern in a village in the suburbs of Paris, at Chalais-en-Montfermeil. If my son meets him, he shall do Thénardier all the service he can. Not from duty towards his father, but on account of that vague respect for death which is always so imperious in the heart of the man, Marius took the paper and pressed it. No trace remained of the colonel. Monsieur Gillenormand had his sword and uniform sold to a second-hand dealer. The neighbors stripped the garden and carried off the rare flowers. The other plants became dreary and scraggy and died. Marius remained only 48 hours at Vernon. After the burial, he went to Paris and went back to his law, thinking no more of his father than if he had never lived. In 2 days the colonel had been buried, and in 3 days forgotten. Marius wore crape on his hat. That was all. Part 3. Marius had preserved the religious habits of his childhood. One Sunday he had gone to hear Mass at St. Sulpice at the same chapel of the Virgin to which his aunt took him when he was a little boy, and being that day more absent-minded and dreamy than usual, he took his place behind a pillar and knelt down, without noticing it, before an Utrecht velvet chair, on the back of which the name was written, Monsieur Mabeuf, churchwarden. The Mass had hardly commenced when an old man presented himself and said to Marius, Monsieur, this is my place. Marius moved away readily, and the old man took his chair. After Mass, Marius remained absorbed in thought a few steps distant. The old man approached him and said, I beg your pardon, Monsieur, for having disturbed you a little while ago, and for disturbing you again now, but you have thought me impertinent, and I must explain myself. Monsieur, said Marius, it is unnecessary. Yes, resumed the old man, I do not wish you to have a bad opinion of me. You see, I think a great deal of that place. It seems to me that Mass is better there. Why? I will tell you. To that place I have seen for 10 years regularly, every 2 or 3 months, a poor, brave father come, who had no other opportunity and no other way of seeing his child, being prevented through some family arrangements. He came at the hour when he knew his son was brought to Mass. The little one never suspected that his father was here. He did not even know, perhaps, that he had a father, the innocent boy. The father, for his part, kept behind a pillar so that nobody should see him. He looked at his child and wept. This poor man worshipped this little boy. I saw that. This place has become sanctified, as it were, for me, and I have acquired the habit of coming here to hear Mass. I prefer it to the bench, where I have a right to be as a warden. I have even acquainted slightly with this unfortunate gentleman. He had a father-in-law, a rich aunt, relatives, I do not remember exactly who, threatened to disinherit the child if he, the father, should see him. He had sacrificed himself that his son might some day be rich and happy. They were separated by political opinions. Certainly I approve of political opinions, but there are people who do not know where to stop. Bless me! Because a man was at Waterloo, he is not a monster. A father is not separated from his child for that. He was one of Bonaparte's colonels. He is dead, I believe. He lived at Vernon, where my brother is curé, and his name is something like Pontmercy, Montpercy. He had a handsome saber cut. Pontmercy, said Marius, turning pale. Exactly, Pontmercy. Did you know him? Monsieur, said Marius, he was my father. The old churchwarden clasped his hands and exclaimed, Ah, you are the child. Yes, that is it. He ought to be a man now. Well, poor child, you can say that you had a father who loved you well. Marius offered his arm to the old man and walked with him to his house. Next day he said to Monsieur Gillenormand, We have arranged a hunting party with a few friends. Will you permit me to be absent for 3 days? 4, answered the grandfather. Go, amuse yourself. And with a wink he whispered to his daughter, Some love affair. Part 4. Marius went to Vernon and spent several hours at his father's grave. Then he returned to Paris, went straight to the library of the law school, and asked for the file of the Monetier. He read the Monetier. He read all the histories of the Republic and the Empire, the Memorial de Sainte Helene, all the memoirs, journals, bullets, proclamations. He devoured everything. The first time he met his father's name in the bulletins of the Grand Army, he had a fever for a whole week. He went to see the generals under whom George Pontmercy had served, among others Count H. The churchwarden Mabeuf, who he had seen earlier, gave him an account of life at Vernon, the colonel's retreat, his flowers, and his solitude. Marius came to understand fully this rare, sublime, and gentle man, this sort of lion lamb who was his father. In the meantime, engrossed in this study, which took up all his time as well as his thoughts, he hardly saw the Gillenormands. At the hours of meals he appeared, then when they took for him, he was gone. The aunt grumbled. The grandfather smiled. Poh, poh, it is the age for the lasses. Sometimes the old man added, the devil, I thought that it was some gallantry. It seems to be a passion. It was a passion indeed. Marius was on way to adoration for his father. At the same time, an extraordinary change took place in his ideas. The phases of this change were numerous and gradual. At this, the history of many minds of our time, we deem it useful to follow these phases step by step and to indicate them all. This history on which he had now cast his eyes stared at him and startled him. The first effect was bewilderment. The Republic, the Empire, had been to him till then nothing but monstrous words. The Republic, a guillotine in a twilight, the Emperor, a saber in the night. He had looked into light, and there they were, where he expected to find only a chaos of darkness. He had seen, with a sort of astounding surprise, mingled with fear and joy, stars shining, Mirabeau, Volnegord, Saint-Just, Robespierre, Camille Desmoulins, Danton, and a sun-rising Napoleon. He knew not where he was. He recoiled, blinded by the splendors. Little by little, the astonishment passed away. He accustomed himself to this radiance. He looked upon acts without dizziness. He examined personages without error. The Revolution and the Empire set themselves in luminous perspective before his straining eyes. He saw each of these two groups of events and men arrange themselves into two enormous facts. The Republic into the Empire, into the sovereignty of the French idea imposed upon Europe. He saw spring out of the Revolution the grand figure of the people, and out of the Empire the grand figure of France. He declared to himself that all had been good. He was full of regret and remorse, and he thought with despair that all he had in his soul he could say now only to a tomb. Oh, if his father were living, if he had him still, if God in his mercy and in his goodness had permitted that his father might be alive, how he would have run, how he would have plunged headlong, how he would have cried to his father, Father, I am here, it is I, my heart is the same as yours, I am your son. How he would have embraced his white head, wet his hair with tears, gazed upon his scar, pressed his hands, worshipped his garments, kissed his feet. Oh, why his father had died so soon, before the adolescence, before the justice, before the love of his son. Marius had a continual sob in his heart which said at every moment, alas! At the same time he became truly more serious, more truly grave, surer of his faith and his thought. Gleams of the true came at every instant to complete his reasoning. It was like an interior growth. He had felt a sort of natural aggrandizement which these two new things, his father and his country, brought to him. From the rehabilitation of his father, he had naturally passed to the rehabilitation of Napoleon. One night he was alone in his little room next to the roof. His candle was lighted. He was reading, leaning on the table by the open window. All manner of reveries came over him from the expanse of space and mingled with his thought. What a spectacle this night! We hear dull sounds, not knowing whence they come. We see Jupiter, 1,200 times larger than the earth, glistening like an ember. The welkin is black, the stars sparkle. It is terror-inspiring. He was reading the bulletins of the Grand Army, those heroic strophes written on the battlefield. He saw that at intervals his father's name, the Emperor's name everywhere. The whole of the Grand Empire appeared before him. He felt as if a tide were swelling and rising within him. It seemed to him at moments that his father was passing by him like a breath and whispering in his ear. Gradually he grew wandering. He thought he heard the drums, the cannon, the trumpets, the measured tread of the battalions, the dull and distant gallop of the cavalry. From time to time he lifted his eyes to the sky and saw the colossal constellations shining in the limitless abysses. Then they fell back upon the book, and their other colossal things were moving confusedly. His heart was full. He was transported, trembling, breathless. Suddenly, without himself knowing what moved him or what he was obeying, he arose, stretched his arms out of the window, gazed fixedly into the gloom, the silence, the darkening infinite, the eternal immensity, and cried, "Vive l'Empire!" From that moment it was all over. The emperor had been to his father only the beloved captain whom one admires, and for whom one devotes himself. To Marius he was something more. He was the very incarnation of France, conquering Europe by the sword which he held and the world by the light which he shed. Marius saw in Bonaparte the flashing spectre that will always rise upon the frontier, and which will guard the future. Despot, but dictator. Despot resulting from a republican summing up a revolution. Napoleon became to him the people man as Jesus is the God man. All these revolutions were accomplished in him without a suspicion of it in his family. When, in this mysterious labor, he had entirely cast off his old Bourbon and ultra skin, when he had shed the aristocrat, the Jacobite, and the royalist, when he was fully revolutionary, thoroughly democratic, and almost republican, he went to an engraver on the Quai des Ouvriers and ordered 100 cards bearing this name, Baron Marius Pontmercy. By a natural consequence, in proportion as he drew nearer to his father, his memory, and the things for which the colonel had fought for 25 years, he drew off from his grandfather. As we have mentioned, for a long time, Monsieur Gillenormand's capriciousness had been disagreeable to him. There was already between them all this distaste of a serious young man for a frivolous old man. So long as the same political opinions and the same ideas had been common to them, Marius had met Monsieur Gillenormand by means of them as if upon a bridge. When this bridge fell, the abyss appeared, and then above all, Marius felt inexpressibly revolted when he thought that Monsieur Gillenormand, from stupid motives, had pitilessly torn him from the colonel, thus depriving the father of the child and the child of the father. Through affection and veneration for his father, Marius had almost reached aversion for his grandfather. Nothing of this, however, as we have said, was betrayed eternally, only he was more and more frigid, laconic at meals, and scarcely ever in the house. When his aunt scolded him for it, he was very mild and gave an excuse his studies, courts, examinations, dissertations, etc. The grandfather did not change his infallible diagnosis. In love? I understand it. Marius was absent for a while from time to time. Where can he go? Asked the aunt. On one of these journeys, which were always very short, he went to Montfermeil, in obedience to the injunction which his father had left him, and sought for the former sergeant of the Waterloo, the innkeeper Thénardier. Thénardier had failed, the inn was closed, and nobody knew what had become of him. While making these researches, Marius was away from the house 4 days. Decidedly, said the grandfather, he is going astray. They thought they noticed that he wore something upon his breast and under his shirt, hung from his neck by a black ribbon.